Welcome back to Free Pizza, your go-to for fascinating stories that blend education with entertainment. Dive into diverse topics from science to history and learn something new with every slice. The year is 2025 and the world is facing a food crisis unlike anything seen in modern history. Grocery store shelves are emptier than ever. Prices for basic goods have skyrocketed, and hunger is becoming a harsh reality for millions of people worldwide. But how did we get here? The food shortage of 2025 isn't an overnight disaster. It's the result of a cascade of interconnected crises that have been building for years. Let's begin with the root cause: climate change. Over the past decade, the planet's shifting climate has wreaked havoc on agriculture. In the United States, the Midwest, a region often referred to as the world's breadbasket, has suffered from back-to-back years of record-breaking droughts. Crops like corn, soybeans, and wheat have withered in the fields, unable to survive the scorching temperatures and lack of rainfall. Across the Atlantic, Europe has faced its own challenges. Southern countries like Spain and Italy, known for their olive oil, wine, and citrus exports, are seeing their farmland dry up. At the same time, Northern Europe has experienced unusual flooding, destroying crops and delaying planting seasons. Asia too has been hit hard. Nations like India and China, home to some of the world's largest populations, are struggling with erratic monsoons and extreme weather that have decimated rice and grain production. But the climate isn't the only factor. Geopolitical tensions have also played a major role. The war in Eastern Europe, which began in 2022, has disrupted global grain markets for years. Ukraine and Russia are two of the world's largest exporters of wheat, barley, and sunflower oil. The conflict has not only destroyed farmland, but has also created ongoing bottlenecks in the export of these vital goods. Even countries far removed from the conflict, like those in Africa and the Middle East, have felt the shockwaves as they struggle to secure food imports at affordable prices. In addition, trade wars and protectionist policies have exacerbated the problem. Countries that used to export their surplus food are now keeping it within their borders, prioritizing their own populations over international trade. This has left food importing nations scrambling to find alternatives, often at much higher costs. Livestock farming hasn't escaped the crisis either. Feed prices have soared due to the grain shortage, making it nearly impossible for farmers to sustain their operations. Many have been forced to slaughter animals prematurely or exit the industry altogether. Meanwhile, disease outbreaks like avian flu and African swine fever have wiped out entire populations of poultry and pigs, reducing the availability of meat and driving up prices globally. Then there's the logistical nightmare. The lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, coupled with new labor shortages and rising fuel prices, have crippled global supply chains. Shipping delays, port congestion, and a lack of truck drivers mean that even when food is available, it often doesn't reach consumers in time. Perishable goods spoil in transit, further compounding the problem. For everyday people, the impact has been staggering. Grocery bills have more than doubled in some areas, with staples like bread, milk, and eggs becoming unaffordable for lower-income families. Food banks are overwhelmed, and governments are struggling to implement effective solutions. In some countries, rationing has been introduced, with citizens limited to a fixed amount of essential goods each month. This crisis has also exposed deep inequalities. Wealthier nations have been able to weather the storm by tapping into reserves and outbidding poorer countries for imports. Meanwhile, developing nations, particularly in Africa and South Asia, are bearing the brunt of the food shortage. Experts estimate that millions of people are now at risk of malnutrition or starvation, with children and the elderly being the most vulnerable. So what are the proposed solutions? Scientists and innovators are racing against the clock to find answers. Technologies like vertical farming, where crops are grown indoors in stacked layers, offer promise but are expensive to scale. Lab-grown meat, once considered a futuristic concept, is gaining traction but remains inaccessible to most. Researchers are also working on developing drought-resistant and heat-tolerant crops to help farmers adapt to changing conditions. Governments are stepping in with policies aimed at stabilizing food systems. Some are investing in domestic agriculture to reduce reliance on imports, while others are providing subsidies to farmers to help them cope with rising costs. International organizations are calling for better cooperation between nations to address the crisis collectively, but achieving consensus has proven challenging in a world increasingly divided by political and economic interests. At the individual level, people are adapting in their own ways. Urban gardening and community farming initiatives are popping up in cities around the world as citizens take matters into their own hands. But these grassroots efforts, while inspiring, can't address the scale of the crisis. The food shortage of 2025 is a stark reminder of the fragility of our global food systems. For decades, we've taken for granted the availability of affordable food, assuming that technology and trade would always keep our plates full. Now we're faced with the reality that those systems are vulnerable to disruption, and that without urgent action, this crisis could become the new normal. The question isn't just how we'll navigate this shortage, but what we'll learn from it. Will we continue down the path that led us here, or will we rethink the way we grow, distribute, and consume food? The choices we make today will shape the future of food security for generations to come. For now, the world is watching, waiting, and hoping for solutions. And as we sit down to our next meal, if we're lucky enough to have one, it's worth considering the bigger picture. What are we willing to do to ensure that no one goes hungry?